This chapter is going to show us just how much infrastructure has been done in the short amount of time. You've got in 1865 this amount of track compared to by 1900, 192,000, spanning over 155 million acres. That land was given by the government to the railroad companies in alternate mile square sections, which allowed them to choose the path where the land was the most valuable. And that land would be withheld until the companies decided which path that was going to take. Grover Cleveland's going to stop that in an effort to open up those lands to settlers who are going to take that land and develop it, nourish it, and make it productive. Over that same period of time, we have the Transcontinental Railroad being developed. That is going to allow the ability for somebody to travel from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. Here you see the joining of those two at Promontory Point, Utah, with the Golden Spike, a momentous occasion where it linked the two sides of the country, and therefore one person could enjoy Christmas in New York and New Year's in California. Pretty impressive, cutting down the average span from weeks to 7 days. Despite that increased transportation, there were still risks associated with the railroads. There was lots of railroad accidents and still somewhat treacherous. We've got a couple of the big companies that we should be able to reference, the big four railroad companies led by Leland Stanford. We've got James J. Hill. We've got the most notorious, Cornelius Vanderbilt. He's the one who's most successful and the most devious in his with his railroad company. And these railroad companies are aided by the new inventions, specifically the air brake, the Pullman car, noted by George Pullman, who is going to create a company town where he's going to reap the profits off of his workers and create a system like in slavery. We've got, in addition to the inventions in the railroad industry, some developments with natural resources. So over that time, we see the natural resources like the Mesabi Range, that yields massive amounts of coal and iron, that allows for that steel production to be done. So that's there. And in an effort to regulate all these railroad companies and provide some sort of scheduling, they had to create time zones that we would now be able to use so we can schedule the trains and when they would be arriving and leaving and avoid the issues that they were running into. In addition to the railroad companies dealing with all these new inventions and developments, we do find ourselves seeing once again Jay Gould, who's trying to make money off of the stocks, and a lot of people were using what was called stock watering, which was the Enron of its days, trying to make your company look more profitable than it really was. And you do that by a number of ways. You could create pools or trusts, which were basically companies coming together, creating a large conglomerate, a big company, if you will, and using that company's market power to create monopolistic environments or to drive out competition. And one group that was impacted the most by that was the Grange. These are farmers who are usually small, independent, and they were being victimized by the railroad companies. And they sue in the Wabash case, and the result of that case is to allow the federal government the right to regulate through interstate commerce clause, as opposed to what was happening back then, the state government attempting to do that. And that's going to require them to create an Interstate Commerce Act, which will be enforced through the Interstate Commerce Commission. And even though they're beginning this process of regulation, it's not going to be easy. There's a number of challenges, specifically by Richard Olney, who's a lawyer on behalf of the railroad companies, and he's going to prevent them from fully regulating those businesses. But we are rapidly industrializing in this period. We go from the fourth all the way up to the number one, and it's for a number of reasons, but here's a couple of the biggies. Abundant capital, there's a lot of money flowing through the system. Obviously, the natural resources. From the example of the Mesabi Range, I showed you the picture earlier. We've got entrepreneurs and inventors like Eli Whitney, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, people you've read about in Destiny of the Republic. You've also got entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie, this guy here, who is a immigrant, rises up from a lowly position to become the wealthiest man in the United States with his U.S. Steel Corporation. In addition, you've got John D. Rockefeller. Oops, sorry about that. who is here, and John D. Rockefeller, who was utilizing his business tactics with the Standard Oil Company and reaping the profits from that industry. And he would be able to force out other competitors by undercutting them with pricing. So even though he's providing cheaper prices, he was doing it with the focus of becoming a monopoly, and once he got to that position, he would then be able to raise the prices as he would be the only supplier of oil. These two businessmen and others are utilizing new tactics that some people have questioned. They've been given the title either robber barons, people who took advantage of their positions and took advantage of the people, did things for their own benefit, not for others, or captains of industry, people who were forward-thinking, were doing things to really provide a benefit to the public by giving them a cheaper product, a more efficient, better produced quality product, whatever it might be. And they used a couple of tactics in this case. You might not be able to see this all that clearly, but on the one side, you've got vertical integration, which is what Andrew Carnegie used. He did that by buying each process of the business. So he would buy the railroad companies, he'd buy the manufacturing plants, he'd buy the iron sites, and he would develop it all. In cutting out the middleman, it would provide him more profits. On the other side, John D. Rockefeller used horizontal integration. He would buy all the competitors. So if you're Burger King, you'd buy McDonald's, you'd buy Wendy's, you'd buy KFC, you'd buy Taco Bell, and by doing that, you would drive out all the competition and be the only company left standing. So those are two business practices that helped their companies become enormous in that time period. In fact, U.S. Steel, when he sells it, Andrew Carnegie, to John Pierre Morgan, it'll be the largest business in the world, the first billion-dollar business, and J.P. Morgan will buy it from Carnegie for $400 million. Now, ironically, Carnegie, who came from that lowly status, never wanted that kind of money in the first place. So over his life, he'll end up donating $350 million of that to charities, pensions, and specifically libraries, in the hopes that others could use those new opportunities and make something of themselves and become someone like him. So that will be in his Gospel of Wealth, which will also look at the poor are poor because they are not doing anything, and the rich are rich because they're active, they're focused, they're driven. So those are some examples of their business tactics. You've also got this guy, John Pierre Morgan. He's a big banker. He starts this thing called interlocking directorates. And basically what that was he would put people on other companies' board of directors. And by having them there, he could influence their decisions and their voting and do it in a way that will make him money or benefit him. And he gets so powerful that he will end up loaning the money to the government, getting high interest rates in return, and a notorious banker in that Gilded Age era. So these guys really just give us a quick overview of what it was like back then and how turbulent that decade or those decades were, and wrought with corruption and all the opportunities that were present. So they would be some examples. Here's where you'll see the Bessemer process, which was one of those inventions Carnegie was able to take advantage of that allowed him to produce the steel and iron at a far better and cheaper price than any other competitor out there, and that's going to help us move all the way to the top of world steel. And that's where you see the Sultan of Steel, for example. And here's where I told you that the U.S. Steel Corporation would be sold to J.P. Morgan for $400 million. Imagine that's before income tax. So, I mean, think about how much money that was, especially when you talk about millions of dollars back then versus $1 million today. I mean, the guy was well loaded. As you look at the rest of the industrialization, specifically that in the South, what you'll see is that they're trying to industrialize, but they're still very much stuck in their agricultural ways. So anybody who's driven down south will see, for example, that they are focused on their products. So, for example, they're going to have those tobacco companies and are still going to be very much geared in that way. So they're somewhat lagging in this era.